This is Haileselassie. My name is Annette Sheckler, and I'll be your host today for the English program of Haileselassie. And today I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Desta Haileselassie Hagos. Thank you, Desta, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Our producer is Sa'arom Hadish. On behalf of Mimi Sabatu, Dr. Desta, and myself, welcome. We'd also like to thank Tigray Media House for using their studio located in scenic Northern Virginia. Today's guest is Dr. Sarah Vaughan, co-author, along with Martin Plaut, of the recently published book, Understanding Ethiopia's Tigray War. It's an extraordinary account of the historical context, the events leading up to the war, an account of the war up to the cessation of hostilities agreement. Dr. Vaughan is no stranger to politics in the Horn of Africa. She's worked in Ethiopia since the late 80s. She is a renowned academic, an honorary fellow of the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, from 2001 to 2021. She's taught African politics and social theory in both Scotland and Ethiopia. Her research interests include the sociology of knowledge, ethnicity, and political interest, decentralization and local government, transitional justice and conflict, and she's the co-author of The Culture of Power in Contemporary Ethiopian Political Life. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Annette. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, we're really excited to have you here. Our last program, we talked to Martin Plaut, your co-author, and had a very interesting discussion. And I think right now we'll start with Dr. Desta.
Thank you, Annette, for the introduction. Thank you so much, Sarah, for taking the time to come and join us here with Haileselassie today. I would also like to congratulate you and Martin Plaut on the success of your recent book, Understanding Ethiopia's Tigray War. It's a wonderfully written book, and congratulations once again for our viewers watching us online. It's a very well written book, and it's a very must read book. You have to get a copy from Amazon or other retailers. We will let you talk about it later. So let's begin from the beginning of the genocidal war on Tigray and the beginning of your book, Chapter 1. In light of your analysis on Chapter 1, you clearly stated that the dominant narrative pushed by the government of Abiy Ahmed on the war on Tigray as a limited law and order was misleading and false. Myself as a Tigrayan, I know there are a lot of evidence that supports your claim, but there are also people from the international community and people from the African Union who initially accept this false narrative as a true. So why do you think the Ethiopian government would want to pick this false narrative and wage a war on Tigray?
My goodness, that's a very good question. I think it's really important to understand that this was not just a war that was waged on the battlefield, it was also waged in the propaganda arena. And in a sense, the battlefield war, it really was as important as the war on the ground. And I think that's one of the reasons why we felt it was terribly important to address head-on this issue of what was the correct narrative, what was really going on. And I think we say in the introduction to the book that this idea that this was a law and order response to an attack by the Tigrayan forces on the Northern Command simply obscured more than it illuminated. And actually this had been very long in the preparation and the gestation. And we felt there was so much evidence that everybody had known, anyone who was following Ethiopia and the Horn in detail had known what was coming. So it wasn't a surprise, and we also knew once it would start, it could be really devastating. But my own view is that there was, by the time of Abiy Ahmed coming to power and the so-called peace deal with Isaias, the die was cast and the pieces were set in motion, and there was pretty much nothing that the Tigray government or the TPLF could have done by then to preempt this. But it's been a very, very effective narrative to say, these are the terrorists, these are the ones who started the war, this was just a law and order operation. This is nonsense. And in a sense, if it continues to be the dominant narrative of what happened, it will undermine Ethiopia's ability to recover and a really sustainable peace to take hold. As they say, I think we're all familiar with the saying, those who forget their history are condemned to repeat it, and those who obscure and manipulate and hide their history, I think that makes it all the more of a risk.
Thank you, Sarah. Let's start at the beginning of your book. The introduction to this, I'm going to hold it up every now and then so that people can see it. The introduction to the book identified land, power, and empire as three unresolved issues on which Ethiopia's war in Tigray turned. And they remain central to a sustainable resolution of the war at the time of writing. Could you talk a little bit about land, power, and empire?
Of course. I mean, I think they're very much intertwined. But in my view, this wasn't about a terrorist attack or something which, you know, these allegations that the TPLF had been trying to undermine Abiy's reformist government. This is nonsense. The real issue was a difference of opinion about how the Ethiopian state should be structured, who should be in power, and how those resources should be controlled. And of course, as we know, land has been the critical resource in Ethiopia for many decades, going right back to the 1965 land to the tiller demonstrations of the student movement. So for me, you know, there are two narratives in Ethiopian politics, and this has been clear for at least 50 years. But I think on the one hand, you've had the EPRDF associated, the ethno-nationalist approach of a decentralized arrangement where different nations, nationalities, and peoples would have their own stake in the empire state, and people who espouse this narrative, the sort of federalist narrative, if you like, are much more interested in having a kind of plurality of voices. But then there's this traditional understanding of the Ethiopian state that, you know, it's a 3,000-year-old project, that it's always been, you know, it's centralized, it's rightly centralized, and that it's centralized with a very highland-dominated culture. So predominance of Orthodox Christianity, the Amharic language, and many powerful families under the imperial period from Shoa, both Amhara and Oromo. So I think, you know, there have been those when EPRDF first came to power in 1991 who hated the federal project, let's be clear, and have hated it ever since, and have done everything they could to try to undermine it. And in a sense, this war is the culmination of that division. So, you know, it was essential to undermine TPLF, to vilify them, to literally demonize them, calling them satanic and so on, in order to wrest back that narrative of Ethiopian nationalism. So I see these two projects of ethno-nationalism, pluralism, the idea that you can be Somali and Ethiopian, Oromo and Ethiopian, Tigrayan and Ethiopian, Amhara and Ethiopian, with this much more centralized narrative. So for me, the war was the decision of contemporary politicians who could have made other decisions. It didn't have to be like this. These are contemporary politicians who decided on a strategy to undermine Tigray, to attack the TPLF, and in so doing to attack the people of Tigray. So there was nothing accidental about it. This is not ethnic conflict, whatever that means. It was a power struggle between two different groups of elites. And on the supporting Abiy Ahmed's approach to war were many in what used to be PRDF, the cadres of the Prosperity Party, but also the government of Isaias Afwerki in Eritrea, and many of those whom he had hosted over the years, who had fallen out over precisely this division. We remember the 2005 election, the failure of some of those Knights politicians to go into parliament, even though they had won seats and were offered Birhanu to become mayor of Addis Ababa.
Sure.
I think if Dr. Birhanu had had the courage in 2005 to go into parliament, we might have been in a very different position now. So these kind of alliances shifting, mutating from Ihapa to Kinijit to Izema, but the same underlying differences of opinion are really the drivers of this war. And I have to say, what worries me today, months after the cessation of hostilities agreement, is that none of these underlying factors have yet been addressed.
I think that's a really important point you just made. I believe that in 2005, when Kinijit declined to take their seats after being elected by their constituency, it was the end of democracy in Ethiopia, the beginning of democracy. It wasn't the government's response, it was Kinijit's response. Because if they took their seats, they could have begun, this democratic, pluralistic process, and I think we would have been at a very different place today.
Yes, I mean, it's always difficult to know what the counterfactual would have been, and let's be clear, EPRDF wouldn't have made Kinijit's lives easy if they'd
Right.
gone into parliament. It would have been, but it would have been a proper test of the federal constitution. We would have seen the multi-level governance, the different levels of government beginning to have to work together. And, as we say in English, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, but we couldn't get to the point where people would actually engage and really do the day-to-day hard work. It was the grandstanding and the hardline positions that dominated. And this is a very kind of powerful characteristic of Ethiopian political culture. You mentioned the book which I wrote with Professor Tronvall back in 2004, saying that there's this very hierarchical culture, and a culture which is doesn't prioritize consensus and compromise. So I think we're still seeing these very kind of polarized positions.
Very good. I have one question on chapter 1 of your book. You mentioned the reason why Abiy Ahmed and his allies waged war on Tigray is to eliminate the Tigrayan as a political force. And many people from the international community also think the reason why Abiy Ahmed waged war on Tigray is because of the September 9, 2020 Tigray election. But that's not true. And given your analysis on the book, you mentioned the root cause of the genocidal war on Tigray goes beyond this, and it's all about issues of power, like Annette mentioned earlier, issues of land and empire. So what specific implementable recommendations or practical solutions do you propose to address these problems?
That's a huge question.
Yeah, I know. So that we can, so that it promotes a sustainable peace in Tigray.
Well, I think, you asked me about land, and I didn't come to that. But
yeah.
The majority of Ethiopia's population are still subsistence farmers, even though urbanization has accelerated. So the value of land is hugely important in agricultural terms, especially in those highland areas where you have a density of population. Hara in particular, I think there's a terrible land hunger. But it's also under pressure because of urbanization and urban expansion. So you see, these vastly inflated real estate prices, for instance, and lease prices in some of those areas. The Debre Marcos corridor is extraordinary, and of course Gojam is a very fertile area, but also in the development corridor south of Addis Ababa. So we've seen, the value that individuals could get for selling their land, whether officially through the leasing system or informally, as increasingly, was very powerful. So I think the appropriation of land around urban centres, of course including Addis Ababa, the whole issue of the master plan, the Finfinne status, got terribly exacerbated as a result of that. But you have this sort of background which is really rooted in the 19th century for me, and this incredible period where under Menelik the Ethiopian Empire State expanded very dramatically. And you have two groups of people in Ethiopia. You have those who were involved and drove and led the expansion, and many are Amharas, but there are also the Shoan or Romo families who are closely implicated in that. And then there are those who are the victims of this process, whose land was expropriated, who suffered, whose families suffered, whose leaders were killed, who were conquered, basically, in the same way that European countries conquered other neighbouring parts of the continent. So these kind of profound differences of relationship with the Ethiopian state, I think, are incredibly important as explaining why there is this powerful divide. For me, in terms of what comes next, I mean, one really does, if one were talking about a real peace agreement and not just a cessation of hostilities agreement, one would need to be addressing power sharing. One would need to be having a proper discussion about what can nationalists, Amhara nationalists, Somali nationalists, really reasonably expect from Ethiopian governance. How can that become inclusive? Now, it's clear that over the last period of EPRDF federalism, there were some groups, particularly urban groups with a mixed ethnicity, who didn't identify with this kind of ethnic federalism, multinational federalism, have felt marginalized by that process. So that is something that needs to be taken on board. But that doesn't mean to say that you swing the pendulum so far back in the other direction that everybody else, the Oromos, the Somalis, many Tigrayan nationalists, feel completely that their backs are against the wall. So this needs an incredibly careful, astute, statesman-like, inclusive and incremental approach. Rather, what we've seen from 2018 is something very different and very irresponsible, in my view.
And clumsy.
Was it clumsy, or was it designed to be clumsy? It's very difficult to know, but I don't think I've really answered your question about what should happen. But it needs to be incremental, inclusive, inclusive of pastoralists, inclusive of women, inclusive of illiterate populations who live far from electricity, not some deal stitched up in Addis Ababa. That's simply not good enough anymore.
I have one
Yes, please.
follow-up. Yeah, thank you. I have one follow-up question to that. Earlier you mentioned about why the Ethiopian elites who want to centralize the Ethiopian system at a national level, they don't like the federal system of the country. And you also mentioned Isaias, and the reason why Isaias doesn't want or doesn't like the Ethiopian federal system is because he wants to eliminate the Tigrayan identity. I mean, in chapter 1 you mentioned the reason why Abiy and Isaias waged war on Tigray is because they want to eliminate the Tigrayan political force. But Isaias' interest goes far beyond that. He wants to eliminate the Tigrayan identity as a means to promote the Eritrean identity. But Isaias was not, he didn't provide his motives or narrative why he joined the war, the genocidal war on Tigray. But if you see the patterns of the crimes committed by the Eritrean soldiers in Tigray over the past 2 years, it supports this claim that they want to eliminate the Tigrayan identity. So why do you think, as an author, as a political analyst, so why do you think Isaias joined the war on Tigray, and why do you think he doesn't like the Ethiopian federal system?
I think, there's a lot of evidence going back over the historical period that Isaias has always been ill-disposed to the self-determination of nations, nationalities and peoples. That's quite clear. You remember from 1983 to 1988, the EPLF and the TPLF didn't cooperate, and they fell out over precisely this issue. And there's, from Isaias's point of view, one could say there are good reasons why he doesn't like multinational federalism and this self-determination, because Eritrea is not a single homogeneous one nation. Mm-hmm. But that was the project. The Eritrean anti-colonial independence project was to the classic nation state, African state building, where you're trying to create an Eritrean identity out of the 9 different nationality groups in Eritrea. So when the TPLF said actually nations, nationalities and peoples should have rights, even up to secession if they so choose, though we can talk about that. I think that was fairly carefully circumscribed in practice. Yeah. I think for Isaias this was a kind of direct, he saw it as a direct attack. And he's been consistent on this. He doesn't like this kind of ethnic politics, if you like, as he calls it. Now, and he's joined in that by some of the Ethiopian nationalists who also complained about Yagosa politica. You remember this language from 2005 in particular. Yeah. Now, my problem with the international community is that they've swallowed this incredibly superficial analysis. Mm-hmm. It's not federalism, it's not EPRDF that ethnicized Ethiopian politics. This goes back to the colonial project by which, the colonial, the expansionist, the imperial project of the 19th century. Now, we can argue for days about, the relationship between Aksum, the Queen of Sheba, the Zagwe dynasty, and the Ethiopian current empire. In a sense, for me, the argument is more, these are markers of current political positions. So, if you're pro the Pan-Ethiopian nationalist group, then you're convinced of this 3,000-year history. If you want to see something about the consequences of modern state building, then you'll be talking about what happened in the 19th century. So, all of these are parts of Ethiopia's history, or parts of Oromia's history, or Benishangul Gumuz's history, and they're differently experienced in different parts of the country. And there are legitimately different views about how Ethiopia should be governed from this point of view, which means you need some really careful, sort of smart, sensible, moderate, compromising politicians to work with each other to overcome these problems. I think the problem with Isaias is that he's none of those things. He's determined that this system, per se, is a threat to Eritrean independence. My personal view is that Eritrea has never been a big enough stage for Isaias. He grew up in the Ethiopian student movement in Addis Ababa. He's a product of that. He spent part of his childhood in Adwa. He's deeply implicated in the Ethiopian process. His father was involved in some of these discussions about the federation with Ethiopia and so on. So, this is a sort of family issue, if you like. Mm. But I also think for Isaias, independence was a means for establishing an independent, impregnable platform from which to continue to interfere in the wider Horn, Ethiopia and the other neighbouring countries. And that's been the problem. So, letting him out of his box, if you like, in 2018 was bound to have these kind of consequences. We knew the situation before the Ethio-Eritrean War in 1998 to 2000. He'd already been in conflict with Yemen over the Hanish Islands, with Djibouti, with Sudan. So, you know, if you let him, his fingers are everywhere in the region, even to DRC, to Rwanda, to South Sudan. So, you know, this was entirely predictable, and it was predicted. This was being talked about from 2018, 2019. But I think people in the international community just didn't appreciate the risk, and still don't appreciate the risk. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, my question was, many people from the international community believe the reason why Isaias joined the genocidal war on Tigray is because of his desire for revenge. But that's not the point I was trying to make. The reason why he joined is because, one, he wants to destroy Tigray, two, he wants to destroy the Tigrayan political force, and three, he wants to eliminate the Tigrayan identity as a means to promote Eritrean identity. That's the point I was trying to make. But do you share these points?
I don't know enough about the Tigray identity issue to say that he was determined to. I mean, I think there is a lot of very strong evidence of a vindictive position. This idea that circulates in Eritrean circles and amongst some expatriates who work on Eritrea who should know better, this idea that Tigray had it coming, that, you know, it was to be punished for what it did to Eritrea. Well, okay, probably the Ethiopian government was influential in getting Eritrea sanctioned in 2009, but there was very good reason for Eritrea to be sanctioned in 2009 by the international community. So, you know, I think this, again, it's part of this narrative of blaming everything on Tigray and the TPLF, when in fact this was a much wider and more complex problem in which many other people who remain in Abiy Ahmed's government are also implicated. I think, you know, the bitterness after the Ethio-Eritrean War of 1998 to 2000, the differences in ideological approach from the 1980s, which we also talk about in the book, they all contribute to this. And then this sort of long kind of Cold War standoff, you know, no peace, no war, no communication, nothing resolved, from 2000 up until 2018, you know, has really kind of solidified these bitternesses and angers. One also wonders what on earth has been done to Eritrean young people, fighters, troops, the Eritrean Defence Force. One wonders about what kind of socialization process they've gone through in Sawa, which has produced this dreadful brutality, and particularly the rape and, I mean, it's not just rape and sexual violence. It doesn't capture the horror of what has been done to, if one is correct in what one hears, tens of thousands of women in Tigray. And that really does go to a kind of desire to cleanse the bloodline or mix the bloodline, not allow Tigrayan women to bear Tigrayan children. So there is circumstantial evidence of that. I mean, I can't sit here and tell you, yes, Isaias wanted to remove the Tigray identity, but he certainly had a lot of resentment, a lot of bitterness over his defeat, let's be clear about it, in 2000.
Yeah.
And I think there has always been a sort of relationship of a current of contempt in Eritrean politics for the Agames. You know, that they're the poor relations. We don't need to treat them seriously. You know, the Eritrean narrative that they're the ones who brought down the Derg with the help of the EPRDF. Okay, they had some armed units in Addis Ababa, but I think that's a bit of an overstatement. So
exactly, I think Isaias always enjoys taking credit of others.
Of course.
Yeah.
But I also think many in the international community have swallowed all sorts of nonsensical propaganda. For instance, I've heard diplomats who should know better saying that, oh, until 1998, Eritrea was really on a path to democracy. This is simply not true, I'm sorry. I think those of us who lived through that period remember just how problematic that period was in the early period of Eritrea's independence. But there's an awful lot of rewriting of history. Let me be blunt, lying. Politicians lying through their teeth about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I think that makes it very difficult for outsiders to get a sense of what's really at stake.
I agree.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you a question about I'm obsessed almost on a daily basis with the lack of compassion from the international community for what happened during those 2 years. You turn on the news in the States now, Sudan, and this is obviously it's not a good situation, but you've got a capital city where the two militaries are fighting each other, and a great deal of attention. Because I could even almost excuse all the attention put on Russia and Ukraine because of our relationship with Russia, etc. But there's a couple of sentences in your book that I just couldn't get out of my head, and I would lay at night thinking about this problem. And if I could just read these few sentences, you say, "But these desperate civilians, Tigrayans, have not been at the center of the moral frame placed around the war by the international community. Their experiences have been silenced and invisibilized, rendered ungrievable." And that word ungrievable, stuck with me to this day, by Ethiopia's systematic media, telecommunications, and internet blackout. Because I shouldn't ask you a question and then give you my opinion first, but we did see the genocide. It was live streamed. It was on our telephones, Eritrean soldiers were sending us photos. I won't even repeat what they were doing because our audience knows what they were doing. So we were watching that. The international community is fully aware of these horrific atrocities, yet you call them invisibilized and ungrievable. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, no, with pleasure, Annette. I mean, this word ungrievable comes from Judith Butler, who's a very well-known feminist philosopher and thinker, who's also was writing, I think, in the wake of 9/11, actually, about the way some people's lives were grieved and then other people's lives were invisibilized. And I think this is something that goes much, much wider than the Tigray war. I mean, we've seen 10 years of war in Syria, where certain parts of that country are invisible, ungrievable. So it's this idea that, and I think that for many in the diaspora, and perhaps also for in Tigray, we, from outside, we think of families here in the States, also in Europe, desperately wanting to know what's happened to their families and not knowing. But also in Tigray, I think they didn't know what was happening to their families outside. So it's a symmetrical thing in a way, though obviously very different experiences. But this kind of undermining the credibility of the experience of Tigrayans, whether there or here, has had a kind of doubly wounding effect. It's been awful what's been done to them. And let's be clear, I mean, this was, whether or not we call it a genocide, we've got 6 very clear categories of horrifying crimes. And in each of those cases, there is at least anecdotal evidence, and I hope it's going to be documented more fully, indications of intent, that these were not accidents of war. Women didn't get raped because 1 or 2 soldiers were bad apples or they did something they shouldn't have done. This was a systematic approach to rape, sexual slavery, torture. We even hear of women who were paid not to be raped. That speaks to intent for me. We hear of even soldiers, Eritrean soldiers in particular, saying to their victims, can you shout and scream and sound like you're being raped so that the guys outside will think that I'm doing my job? That speaks to intent. There's overwhelming evidence that this was not something that just happened. We've also got huge numbers of civilians, mostly men, including older men and boys, who were executed, often in front of their family members. We've got the displacement, what Antony Blinken, I think, rightly called in the early days of the Biden administration, ethnic cleansing. We've got this incredibly pervasive and effective ethnic profiling of Tigrayans living in other parts of the country. Whether it's the 17,000 Tigrayan origin members of the Ethiopian National Defence Force.
Mm-hmm.
Just think about that for a minute. You intern 17,000 members of your own professional army with no charge, for nothing other than their ethnicity.
And we read about it.
Yes, we knew about it. There is also the issue of indiscriminate aerial bombardment, both from the air, from artillery, and then this horrifying use of drones. And I think I do want to stress that this was dreadful in Tigray. It's also been absolutely horrifying in Oromia. I think the use of drones in Western Oromia and some more central areas towards the end of the war in Tigray. It's really important to remember that Tigray is only one strand of this dreadful violence. And then, worst of all and most horrifying of all for those of us like me who've looked at Ethiopia and Tigray since the 1980s is this forced starvation and the destruction of the means necessary to survival. These are crimes in international law. International law is very clear. The legal framework to bring prosecutions if necessary, but to regard this as atrocity crimes, as the UN calls them, is absolutely clear. And we know this is not the first time this has been done. I remember Tigray in the 1980s. It wasn't as effective as what this government have done, but this kind of idea of encircling a region, destroying its animals, its grain, its everything to jerry cans, doors, beds, cooking pots, and then encircling it so that nothing gets in from the outside. This is a horrifying level of intent. It takes a degree of organization that goes well beyond the troops on the ground. So I think I've strayed a little bit from your question, but one thing I think I would slightly disagree with you about is, I think for Tigrayans and those who've had their families in the theatre of conflict in harm's way, they followed it in great detail. It is true that some people in the international community have known what's going on, but because of this invisibilization, the telecoms block out, the media block out, it's still not possible for an independent international journalist officially to go to Tigray.
True.
So, this means that it's very difficult for people to hear about it. I talk with my friends in the UK and they're like, but we don't hear anything about this. It's not on the news. It's not on the news because it's being deliberately blacked out.
Exactly.
And I think that's one of the things that makes proper human rights investigations and accountability terribly important in order to bring about a sustainable and just peace going forward.
Yeah. You mentioned the intent of the crimes committed in Tigray. And you also said what has been done to Tigrayans is awful. And as someone, as a Tigrayan from the diaspora who has been, together with my friends in the diaspora, who has been compiling evidence over the past 2 years, mainly in the civilian killings, I know how it feels and I know what exactly you meant by that. And reading your book, you cited the data from the University of Ghent. It says the estimated civilian death toll is more than 600,000. But from other credible reports, I also know the death toll of civilians is somewhere between 800,000 up to 1 million. And as a Tigrayan, I could, you could understand what would make me feel to see or to read at least more than 1 million people of your ethnic background killed as a result of these heinous crimes of Eritreans and Ethiopians. So given the gravity of these estimates, like from 800,000 to 1 million, do you believe that the international community has a moral obligation to demand accountability and justice? If so, what are the practical steps?
Of course they do. I mean, these are massive crimes. This was the most violent war on the planet during 2022, exceeding the deaths of civilians, and the deaths of combatants were much, much higher than they were in Ukraine, for instance. Now, I mean, it's very difficult to know what the figures are. And that's another instance of injustice, I don't know. I can't sit here today and tell you how many people died. But we know that it was hundreds of thousands. But the fact that we don't know how many died, the fact that we can't read their names, memorialize them, grieve them, this is what I mean by saying it's been rendered ungrievable. And I don't see how one can have any kind of peace, let alone a just and sustainable peace, without a process of proper investigation and accountability. Now, for me, investigation needs to stand separately from any other considerations. Whether you decide to prosecute people, whether you decide to have some kind of truth and reconciliation process, whatever Ethiopians and their international partners decide to do, you can't move forward unless you've documented what happened. And it absolutely has to be documented in a credible way. And this is where I think the international community is making a huge mistake. For instance, they worked very hard at the beginning of the war, recognizing the horror and the scale of what was being done, despite the blackout, to establish this UN International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, so-called ICHRI, which was a group of 3 very eminent international lawyers from different continents, who've been working to try to investigate as best they can. Not given access to conduct research on the ground by the Ethiopian government, but we're in 2023. You can do these things remotely. You can do something to keep the Tigray war maybe off the TV screens of average Americans or Europeans. But that doesn't mean to say that the satellite evidence isn't there, the remote interviews aren't there, the interviews with people who managed to escape to Sudan. Goodness only knows what their situation is now. I hope we'll come back to Sudan before we finish. But, there is information there, but it takes a long time to investigate these processes. To give you 2 examples, the tribunal which was, or the investigation process which was set up for Myanmar and the process that was set up for Syria, these are both working remotely. They're not having their people on the ground because in Myanmar and in Syria, the government won't allow them any more than the Ethiopian government will allow them. But that doesn't mean to say they can't work and they can't do something extremely important. And I would like to see the International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia allowed to continue its work for as long as is necessary. And don't forget, they have the mandate not only to look at the Tigray theatre, but also to look at the killings in Oromia, in Amhara, in parts of the south, what do we even know about the fate of the Gumuz in Matakal zone, which has been incommunicado for years now? The 4 Walegas. We hope that there will be some cessation of hostilities agreement negotiated now with the OLA. But, that part of Oromia has been out of communication since January 2019, almost 2 years before the war started in Tigray. So the mandate of that commission is anything from November 2020, and they will need time to be able to understand what happened.
True.
And can the Ethiopian government be part of this?
Look, I don't think there has to be one process. Yes, of course the Ethiopian government will want to do its own investigation, but can an Ethiopian government body collect information in such a way which is going to satisfy victims in Tigray? Of course it can't. This is nonsense. Even before you get to the politics of the institution. Now, Commissioner Daniel Bakale is a very brilliant lawyer. He's a human rights activist long before he was made commissioner. But he was prosecuted for crimes against the constitution by the EPRDF, TPLF-led government. So, how can he be expected to have a neutral position on this?
Exactly.
I think for outsiders, they say, okay, the Human Rights Commission, it's an A-rated commission. That's fantastic. It's all we need to know. If they really want to do what their rhetoric says and adopt a victim-centered approach to investigations, they must allow, they must facilitate, they must continue to have this international component, fully international, not just the UNOHCHR East Africa office working with Daniel Bakale. That is not adequate. That is not going to be seen to be just by women in Oromia, in Tigray, in Amhara. It's not, it has not just to be just, it has to be seen to be just. So for me, this is absolutely essential. And I mean, if I may, the beginning of this week, we saw a statement coming from the European Union Council of Foreign Ministers talking about the final report of ITRI in September. This is a travesty. And I entirely agree with the Human Rights Watch statement, which came out yesterday, saying that the international community is setting the bar far too low. This is a very, very serious issues which need to be properly investigated. And if the Ethiopian government were committed to a just and sustainable peace, they would be encouraging ITRI to continue its work.
Yeah.
But I think there's still this sense that we can paper over what happened, we can create this ongoing narrative. And I fear that the struggle over the shape of Ethiopia, whether it's going to be centralized or decentralized, it's not finished yet. The Tigray war didn't start on November the 3rd, 2020, and it didn't end 2 years later.
Yes.
It's, this is a political process, and it's still in play. And there are many people, as you know, who are not happy with the cessation of hostilities agreement. We have at least one Eritrean general, I believe, who's quoted as saying we have unfinished business in Tigray. This should be very, very worrying to the international community.
And if we could disaggregate the rest of Ethiopia from the international community and the people of Tigray, I found their response absolutely horrifying. I mean, you lived in Ethiopia, I lived in Ethiopia. Ethiopians have been our friends, our closest friends for decades, And I was in Rwanda right after the genocide. And I used to say, Ethiopians, they have their weaknesses. They will never commit the kind of heinous crimes that were committed by the Hutu government in Kigali. And now I'm wondering, particularly in the diaspora, where were their voices? Where were the voices of the non-Tigrayans? And if you looked at some of the demonstrations, you would see Oromo there, flying their flag. And, I used to feel good and felt that, humanity had a chance. But in the meantime, the non-Tigrayan Ethiopians were living their lives as if nothing was happening. How do we explain this as human beings?
It was a very, very difficult aspect of the war, I think. I mean, even for me as an outsider, I have many, many friends who said some dreadful things. Look, these things don't happen by accident. They don't come up by themselves. People don't wake up one morning and decide that they hate Tigrayans or that the TPLF is a terrorist organization. These were manufactured narratives, and they were manufactured for a very long time, and explicitly so. I mean, and it wasn't secret, but it was difficult for outsiders in the international community to understand the extent and the scope of what was going on. I think if one doesn't speak Amharic, Tigrinya, Afan Oromo, it's very difficult to understand the depth of the viciousness of these narratives. But I mean, we single out a number of points in the book. I think the episodes of 2016 in Gondar, when we know that several tens of thousands of Tigrayans left Gondar in the wake of some horrifying propaganda from the Ethiopian satellite TV station, which, as far as I understand, is based and operating in the US. I think
Yes,
this is highly problematic.
Yes.
I mean, there have been explicit calls for an attack on Tigray. I think it was July 2020, so several months before the the law and order operation because of the attack on the Northern Command, ISAT was calling for, let's cooperate with Eritrea to get rid of TPLF once and for all. This is hate speech. This is clearly organized, advocated hate speech. And we know now that ISAT was financed by the Eritrean government.
Yeah.
We know there's there's been some very interesting work done, I think it was by Harvard researchers, looking at the social media patterns of mobilization during the war and tracing them back to some of these associated groups. So, for me, this is it's a war that was long in the planning, and as I say, it was not just a war on the ground, it was a war of propaganda. And that propaganda started a long time ago to draw on some of the tropes, the biases against Tigrayans. And every time EPRDF was described as TPLF-led, it reinforced a narrative which actually I think was false. It is true that the TPLF was the senior party when EPRDF was established. But things evolved, things changed over the period. I think the dominant character of the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi gave people the opportunity to say it was Tigray dominated. It was perhaps dominated by a particularly brilliant individual. But, after his death, there was a real group of politicians from the south, from Oromia, from other parts of the country, who were heavily involved in EPRDF decision making. So, I think there's still a lot of academic work to be done on these narratives of anti-Tigray mobilization. But Ethiopians have been duped. They may have been happy to be duped, they may have been willingly ignorant, but until this changes and these things are discussed openly, I don't see how Tigrayans can feel secure. I think it's remarkable the progress that's been made since the cessation of hostilities agreement. But for women who have been raped, still to have Eritrean defense forces in their uniforms, in their villages, in the northwest of Tigray, how must they be feeling? This isn't over yet. And I think the international community has been very, very lax and, as I say, setting the bar too low, as Human Rights Watch puts it, in terms of holding the Ethiopian government to account. These are foreign forces on Ethiopian soil.
Yeah, exactly. That was my follow-up question. You also mentioned about the 6-pager document released by the European Union Council on the 24th of April. And like you said, if the Tigrayan victims have to receive justice, there should be international organizations as a part of the investigation. However, if you read this 11 points, concluding points from the European Union's Council, there is no mention of the withdrawal of Amhara forces from the southern and western part of Tigray. There is no mention of the withdrawal of the Eritrean forces. There is no mention of international mechanisms for justice and accountability. There is no also mention of recognizing the Tigray genocide. So as an expert, as an author, how do you assess this? How do you think will this affect the situation in Tigray?
Yeah, I'm very disappointed. I mean, I think there has been quite a battle within the European Union. It's not a secret to say that some states were more keen to renew the relationship with Abiy, France and Germany in particular.
Yeah.
Some other states, the Scandinavian countries, Ireland, wanted much more caution and wanted safeguards to be put in, indicators which would be satisfying them. I mean, I think apart from the accountability issue, which is really problematic, they're making a big mistake. The international community were willfully ignorant in 2019 when they gave Abiy a Nobel Peace Prize. What do you say? If you fool me once, more
shame on you.
Yeah, exactly. If you fool me twice, shame on me. Yeah. And I think this is what's happening now. But look, we have to be realistic. Politics is the art of the possible. This is about a newly multipolar world. Ethiopia is in an important strategic location. I think it's not possible for, whatever they wanted to do. I'm not sure that the Human Rights Council would have would have continued the mandate of the Commission. And that really speaks to something profoundly distressing about African politicians, African intellectuals.
The AU.
Yeah, the AU, exactly.
The EU, but also, there have been some very important African intellectuals who've spoken out. But this nonsense about African solutions for African problems and the mobilization of Pan-Africanism in order to
Protect
advocate.
Ethiopia.
Well, yeah, and in order to protect an African, to protect the ability of a state to murder and rape and slaughter an African people. What does this mean? What does Pan-Africanism mean? And this is, Alice in Wonderland politics. I find it extraordinary that, some of the African-American journalists and academics have really swallowed this stuff. But also the African Union, it really needs to reflect on what has it done. Plus, we've been told that it's important for the international community not to involve in Ethiopia's internal affairs. This is a sovereign nation and so on, and that actually the brotherly African countries should come to the support of Ethiopia's sovereignty. Where have been those Pan-African voices in the last week talking about Sudan?
Yeah.
I've only seen Tigrayans on social media expressing their concern and their solidarity with their African brethren. So maybe just one point on Sudan. I think it's very important that we learn a very key lesson about Sudan. And it has its own dynamic. It's very complex. We can't go into it here. But I would say that the one lesson we need to learn is if you stick a superficial peace deal, so-called, the CPA in this case in Sudan, which doesn't address Darfur, doesn't address Abyei, doesn't address XYZ, and then you just let it fester for 20 years, this is what happens. And this is my concern about Ethiopia now. If we don't get proper investigation, if we don't get a serious deliberative processes which addresses everybody's needs, if we don't get a committed de-escalation of hate speech, including from these terrible satellite TV stations, the risk in Ethiopia is that we will be where Sudan is today, with Khartoum being torn apart.
Our time is up. Dr. Sarah Vaughan, this has been an incredible conversation. We want to thank you so much on behalf
thank
of
you so much, Sarah.
Desta and Mimi Sabatu, our third partner. I would like to encourage, this book is extraordinary, everyone.
Yeah.
Understanding Ethiopia's Tigray War. Buy it on Amazon.com. Get your paperback copy. Get it on Kindle. Go to your public library. It's a must read for anybody who's interested in what happened and why it happened, and hopefully how we move forward.
Yeah.
Thank you, Annette. I should say that the book is published with Hearst in the UK at the moment, but it will be published in the US on the 15th of May. So those of you who are waiting to get a copy, it should be available soon.
Thank you all,
Thank you.
and we'll see you next time.